Okay, History 131, Chapter 16. I've written the words, I've tried to write the words, bury my heart at Wounded Knee. It's the title of a book about the struggles of Indians, mostly Native Americans, mostly in the West. And it came out in like 1970. And it was kind of on the required reading list for progressive students, although we didn't use the word progressive back then. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. So chapter 16 is the conquest of the West. And I like that it's called the conquest. In decades past, they might have called it something like the settling of the West, you know, where the image is European Americans coming in and civilizing the place, civilizing the area. And regarding Native Americans basically as inconsequential, uncivilized, which technically they don't really qualify as civilizations, you know, in a sort of anthropological, technical sense. Nonetheless, they have a right to their land and their lifestyle, apparently, you know. From the moment Europeans land in North America, in what's going to become the United States, they sort of need more land, and whenever you're talking about land, you're talking about Native Americans who are in possession of the land, and they have to be dispossessed in one way or another. And that goes across the continent. And in this chapter, you're sort of talking about the very last phase of struggles with Native Americans. Okay? It's kind of odd because chapter 15 about Reconstruction is basically it's the story of how freed slaves, for a brief period till 1877, and in some places a little bit longer, are allowed to vote. They're allowed to get elected to office. They're allowed to serve on juries. They're allowed to serve as witnesses. It takes a while for the Southerners to set up Jim Crow laws and stuff like that. But that period of Reconstruction ends, or begins to end, when the federal troops are taken out in 1877. And from that point on, it gets worse and worse. Increasing lynchings and discrimination, Jim Crow laws. Eventually it gets so that hardly anywhere in the South can black people vote. And I read an article, I graded the artifact assignments, and a lot of people sort of mentioned that, those 7 congressmen were a sign of progress. And they were, but the progress only goes on for a very brief period. And a lot of Americans like to think that progress is, our most important business, and that things are always getting better, like that Beatles song. And it's just not true. It's just not true. The period from like maybe 1865 to 1877 is like an anomaly in the rest of the history of the southern United States and the United States in general. I read an article in Wikipedia about congressmen in the U.S., a black congressman in the U.S. Congress, okay? And the figure was something like 23,000 people have, I get mostly men, but 23,000 something people have served in the Congress, that's the House of Representatives and the Senate, since, the beginning of the country, the Constitution going into effect, right? Only 161 of those have been African Americans. And most of that 161 are like since 1965. It's modern times. There's a long, long period where African Americans are just driven out. And a number of people sort of seem to think that the fact that you had 7 African American congressmen in the 1870s was a sign of the willingness of the South to change their ways. And that's also not true. The reason why you were able to get those congressmen is that if black people in the South have a vote, they can elect, in parts of the South, South Carolina and Mississippi, blacks are a majority. And in other places it's like, 40-60 or something like that. They can get black people elected if they have the vote. If you refuse to give them the vote, then they can't. But anyway, Chapter 15 is sort of the imposition of second-class status on blacks in the South, and sort of by connection in the North. You can't contain segregation. If you load up a train in New Orleans and it's going to Chicago, and there are black cars and white cars, you don't stop someplace along the way, St. Louis or something, and mix the people up. It rolls into Chicago the same way, segregated. And leaving Chicago, it has to leave the same way because they're not going to do that on the return trip. So segregation, which is like based in law in the South, becomes based in sort of custom and without actual laws in the North. Okay. Chapter 16 involves the conquest of the West, and it really is a conquest, both in a sort of physical military way, but also in tying the West to sort of the Eastern economic system. So you kind of make the West an adjunct, a part of the Eastern economy. But in Chapter 16, there are 3 minority groups that are pushed into second-class status. Native Americans come close to being wiped out. Okay? And it starts right off, the chapter starts right off with that. The Western tribes, okay, who were probably the strongest opponents that the U.S. cavalry, the U.S. Army faced in the whole march. Okay? Indians in the East were pretty tough also. Most of us have heard about Custer's Last Stand, the Battle of the Little Bighorn. If you haven't, you should watch the movie They Died with Their Boots On, because it's a classic. But that wasn't the worst defeat of the U.S. Army by Native American forces. That was the Battle of the Wabash in 1791, where a guy named Arthur St. Clair, and that's part of the reason I know about it, was defeated by a group of Miami Indians in a large confederacy, and the number of casualties the U.S. Army suffered compared to how many forces were involved was higher than any battle that the U.S. Army fought anywhere in the world. Right? So Indians were tough. There's no getting around it. The other group they talk about is, he talks about Hispanic New Mexico. Let's see if we can get there. Hispanic New Mexico and Hispanic California and Texas, and then thirdly the Chinese migration, and then what happened to the Chinese. I'm not going to go into that a lot. I will say this: I think it's odd to call Spanish-speaking people in the West Hispanic. Hispanic is not a racial term. There are black Hispanics and white Hispanics. It's a cultural term. It denotes somebody who grew up speaking Spanish either in Spain or in one of the colonies of Spain that are now independent: Cuba, Colombia, Bolivia, Argentina. The list goes on and on. I'm never sure if it includes Portuguese like in Brazil. I really don't know. But I'm pretty sure that in New Mexico and Texas and California, there were no Dominicans, no Puerto Ricans out there. So I don't know why you don't just call them Mexican Americans. I don't really know if that's like he's being politically correct or he's just kind of glossing over something. It's confusing to me. You know, if you're in New York City, if you're in the Bronx, and there's a neighborhood that has Dominicans and maybe Venezuelans and Cubans and Puerto Ricans and you know, people from many Spanish-speaking countries, you would call it a Hispanic neighborhood. That makes sense. But there are no Dominicans in New Mexico, so I don't know why he doesn't call them Mexican Americans. All right, and you know, all three of them are sort of tragic stories. How do those Mexican Americans become Mexican Americans and not just Mexicans? Well, there's a war fought in 1846. It's kind of clearly imperialist. Okay. You have to go back to Texas. All right. Texas is part of Mexico. From the time that Mexico gets its independence from Spain, 1821. They're looking to bring settlers in, so they give land grants to Moses Austin, I think, and then his son inherits it when Moses dies. And he brings in, gets people from the southern United States to come in. There's a bunch of Germans that migrate there at some point. And the white Southerners, not all of them owned slaves, but the ones that did own slaves wanted to bring their slaves into Mexico, but that was illegal. The Mexican Constitution of 1821 said slavery was illegal. And so what they did was they claimed, oh, these are my employees. And I guess there was a lot of winking and nodding and bribing and stuff at the border, but they were able to bring in their slaves. And eventually, they set up a slave economy in Texas, and the federal government of Mexico wants to get rid of it, and it leads to tensions, and you get a war of Texas independence that probably should be called the War to Restore Slavery to Texas. Right? I know none of these ideas I ever have will fly, but I'm sharing them with you because you take my class. So, all right. They immediately, once they get their independence, they immediately apply for statehood in the United States. And I believe Jackson is the president. And he won't hear of it because it's going to raise tensions between free and slave states. And so Texas has to wait until like 1844 or something to that effect. To become a state. In 1844 or whatever it is, it's not the right book. There's a dispute about the southern boundary of Texas. The Americans, the United States claims it's the Rio Grande, and Mexico claims it's a more northerly river called the Nueces. I think it's Polk sends troops to Texas. And they're on the Nueces River, and the Mexicans are on the Rio, are on the other side of the Nueces River. And lo and behold, the shot goes off. There's a war, and you can read about the details in Volume 1 if you have a copy of it, or just go to your Wikipedia page. The United States ends up with what's called the Mexican Cession. Texas is already independent, but they get that area to the Rio Grande. That gets to be the border. They also get New Mexico, which has a large population of Native Americans and Spanish people, Spanish-speaking people, Mexicans. They get Arizona, which is sparsely settled, Nevada, California, which is a pretty, part. I think Utah is part of the Mexican cession, and maybe part of Colorado. I'll have to look at a map sometime. But they get all of this for $20 million. Anybody have any idea what California is worth today? It's like the world's fourth largest economy or something like that. It's got to be worth more than 20 million. I'm sure there are buildings in California, single buildings that are worth more than 20 million. But in all these areas where Mexicans had settled, the Anglos, we'll call them Anglos, the white Americans, the Anglos come in and basically through violence or fraud or swindling or keeping Mexicans from voting or all that kind of stuff, they push Mexican Americans into second-class status. And once California, a few years later, experiences the gold rush, it just becomes a completely different place. Right? The Chinese have a very, we think mostly of immigration to this country through the East Coast, and even more so through New York and Ellis Island. Okay? I'm not sure when they started using Ellis Island, but my ancestors didn't come through Ellis Island. I remember my brother telling me about my niece in middle school or something, where they were doing a whole big thing about Ellis Island, and she was like, no, we were here before they started using it. So, but there's also immigration from across the Pacific. And the Chinese start showing up even before the gold rush, but with the gold rush, there's a lot more Chinese that show up. And the story is basically that they're very efficient, hardworking. I think the word is abstemious. They don't drink, they don't gamble. They're not, that kind of people. They just work. They work hard. And of course, once they start succeeding better than the Anglos, they manage to pass a foreign miners tax and figure out other ways to keep them out of the gold fields. And eventually, as with all mineral hits, you strike silver someplace. There's silver actually close to the surface, gold close to the surface. People can come in and make some money with very little equipment, a pan in the river and things like that. And the Chinese are doing that. But eventually, and the whites are doing that too. But eventually, actually, the California Gold Rush, there were people that came from Europe, from Australia, from all over the place to get rich, and most of them didn't. Okay. But once the gold on the surface or the silver on the surface runs out, you need mining companies to dig, and you need equipment, and you need capital investment, and all that kind of thing. So, and once that happens, the prospectors, the independent prospectors, are finished. They'll either leave or go to work for the mining corporations. For the Chinese, once the mines give out, the gold rush gives out, they go to work for the railroads, and there are these pretty intense struggles, striking and stuff like that. The Chinese are building, I guess it's this, I'm never sure if it's the Central Pacific or the Union Pacific, but the Chinese are building from the west to the east, and gangs of Irish workers are moving from the east to the west. Now, of course, the Irish have Kansas and flat places. It's hard work, no doubt, but it's not building bridges and railways in the Rockies, digging tunnels, blowing tunnels and stuff like that. That's much harder work. And in the winter, the Chinese would dig like sort of igloos out of the snow, and they were always in danger of suffocating when the snow collapsed, stuff like that. They mention in here a strike. The spring of 1856, 5,000 Chinese railroad workers rebelled and went on strike. The company just isolated them, surrounded them with strike breakers, and starved them into submission. That'll do the trick. Once the railroad was done, they basically were no longer welcome in this country. Right? And beginning on the West Coast, they would move into a particular area of the city that we now call Chinatowns. It's probably not politically correct, but I don't know what else. I've never heard anybody else call them anything. And at some point, it became like a political issue to, maybe some of us are familiar with this, because today it's not aimed at the Chinese. It's, as a political issue, it's aimed at other groups. But the Chinese were a hot political issue, and by campaigning on getting rid of them, you could get elected to office. And in fact, there's something called the Chinese Exclusion Act, passed in 1882. It banned Chinese immigration into the United States for 10 years and barred Chinese already in the country from becoming naturalized citizens. Completely unconstitutional, if you ask me. Okay? People that are already in the country can be denied naturalization or becoming citizens because of what their ethnic group is. It was renewed in 1892 and made permanent in 1902, but I don't think it's still in effect, so I'm not sure what they mean by permanent there. Okay. I want to look into it. There was also a large movement of white people into the West, using the Homestead Act to get land. And you needed more land in the West than you did in the East to make a viable living. So other laws were passed to give you more acreage for low cost. Okay. Now there's a section on the economy. I'm going to skip over most of it, and just say this: it really is a kind of process of linking Western activities to Eastern capitalism. You have these mine companies coming in. There's the whole cattle business, okay, which gives us the cowboy, this mythic figure in American history who is like a knight, a loner. It's all bullshit. Sorry, it's all lies. The cowboy was the real cowboy was a 15-year-old kid who was in the saddle for 18 hours. He ate crappy food. He had to sleep out in the rain. There weren't tents. Nobody carried tents around. And he got paid enough to buy a gun and a new shirt and boots when he got to Dodge City or Abilene or wherever. And then he would go to the whorehouse and lose it all. They would steal the rest of his money and give him a trip. And as the trains move further across the prairie, the cattle drives move further east. Right? There's a whole. It's a fascinating subject. The myth of the cowboy, like how it gets started and stuff like that. It mostly has to do with Buffalo Bill Cody and his Wild West shows. Sort of like circuses, but with a Western theme. So he hires Annie Oakley to shoot half dollars out out of the sky, out of the air. He stages stagecoach robberies. He brings a few buffalo around. He hires Sitting Bull, which is a fascinating thing. He hires Sitting Bull, who was one of the Native American chiefs at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And basically all Sitting Bull has to do is be Sitting Bull. They go off to Europe, to Germany. I think they meet the Queen. I'm not sure about that. But, and then they start this whole fervor for the West in Europe. That like the Germans are still crazy about cowboys. And they still think Americans mostly wear cowboy hats all the time. You know, it's kind of weird. Novels, dime novels, paper, you know, the first movies, the first real movies with stories, a lot of them had to do with cowboys. When I was a kid, I think it's 1959, I was 6 years old. I've read, I don't remember this, but I remember some of the shows, but I've read that 5 of the top 6 television shows in 1959 were Westerns. So it's a kind of clear obsession for Americans. All right, now the dispersal of the tribes. You know, you've had Americans moving across the country and driving people out. I might take a break and set this up as a second, part 2. A lot of times when you're reading American history textbooks, they do not mention the word imperialism until you get to 1898 and the Spanish-American War. And that's because they think that imperialism has to have colonies, formal colonies. And it really isn't until 1898 that the United States Cuba is a colony briefly, Puerto Rico is a colony briefly, and the Philippines are a colony until 1946. And we have to, you know, we're just like England or France in Africa or parts of Asia, or, you know, a colonial power. But really, long before 1898, the actions of Americans, of European Americans, white Americans, towards Native Americans are imperialism. We're taking land, we're pushing them back, we're downgrading their way of life and stuff like that. They become subject to the laws of the United States in a weird way, but they have no say in how those laws work or what those laws are. Okay, for a very long time, let's see, the tribes were thought of as independent nations, which the United States could negotiate treaties with, and as wards of the president, who could exercise paternalistic authority over the Indians. Paternalistic meaning like fatherly, like the Indians are his children. And I'm sure, you know, well, maybe I'm not sure of anything anymore, but you may have seen a movie where they said the Great White Father, you know, speaking of, I don't know, some president, right? Before 1860, the government spends a lot of time trying to erect a permanent frontier between white America and Native American America. And it just can't be done. You know, the British tried to do it with this line of demarcation down the East Coast, like where the Appalachian Mountains are. In Virginia in the 1600s, the governor won't let settlers past a certain line on the west, and it leads to Bacon's Rebellion. In almost all cases, every time they set a line, land hunger means that people have to cross that line. Okay? And the reason for that is land is terribly important to American colonists and American citizens, white American citizens. They always need more land to grow their crops and to live and stuff like that. But it's also getting a hold of land is a way of speculating and making money. You know, getting out of debt, and getting rich by grabbing up land that used to belong to Native Americans and now is free to use. Okay? By the early 1850s, the American government creates a reservation policy known as concentration. And each tribe gets assigned a reservation, a part of the West. They make it, they sign treaties to confirm the existence of these. The treaties are often signed by people that haven't any authority on the Native American side. You know, the Sioux and the Cheyenne and the Comanche do not have a constitution. They don't have a Congress. Their chiefs are chiefs by virtue of their wisdom and their bravery as warriors and all these other things. But they don't really have authority over other people. And the people that they sign the treaties with are generally sarcastically referred to as, you know, the treaty chiefs. The treaty chiefs. So that, you know, the government gets a few guys who aren't the big chiefs in the tribe, gets them drunk, one way or another, gets them to put their mark on a treaty and says, "Oh yeah, that's done. I witnessed it," you know. And usually the reservations are in crappy land. That's going to get even crappier as time goes on. It divides the tribes, makes them easier to control. The tribes are forced into scattered locations, and then the whites could take over the most desirable parts of the land, the most desirable lands. And in many cases, the Indians are not really happy with this situation. Once you're on a reservation, you can't go out hunting buffalo the way you used to. And you become dependent on government sort of handouts. And it really is a way of controlling you. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is a government agency meant to administer these reservations, is highly corrupt or incompetent, one or the other. I know most of you have heard the story about smallpox blankets that are infected with smallpox. That doesn't happen until late in the 19th century, but it's as a result of these Bureau of Indians stuff. Okay? So Indians would leave the reservations, and then they're regarded as criminals, renegades, something like that. There's an area of the Black Hills where Mount Rushmore is that were given to the Native Americans, I think the Sioux, in perpetuity, which means forever. And then shortly that may have been the Treaty of 1853, the Laramie Treaty. But after that, gold is discovered in a part of the Black Hills. You can't keep people from going after gold. Right? The Spanish were crazy about gold. Everybody's crazy about it. It seems like all white people are crazy about gold. So they would go on the reservation illegally and begin looking for gold. And the Sioux warriors would say, "Hey, this is our land, get off." And their fights would break out. and then the government would be forced to send troops to support its citizens who were breaking the law, and they would end up signing a different treaty that cut down, so now they don't have the land with the gold. They're a little further west. Okay? Probably the key thing, though, is that the Plains Indians, the Sioux, the Comanche, the Cheyenne, Arapaho, all of these tribes had only gotten horses in like 1650 or so. And they were transformed from like a sort of kind of a very poor group to a relatively rich group. Because with horses, you could hunt much more buffalo. You could eat much more meat. You could build bigger tents because a dog can only pull a very small tent. A horse or a team of horses can pull a gigantic teepee. Guys were able to take more wives because they had more meat. They could feed more children. They could get more robes and stuff and skins for the tents and all that kind of stuff. They lived off the buffalo, the bison, okay, and they used the skins for robes and tents, the meat to eat, the horns for ceremonial things, the sinews for their bows, the bones for different tools and stuff like that, all that kind of stuff. And they were huge. I mean, really, I don't like to use the word huge, but in this case, it's really, there were numerous buffalo on the plains, two gigantic herds, one up in the north and one in the south, numbering millions of buffalo. And see if I can find this figure because it's shocking. The number of buffalo is reduced enormously. Here we go. In 1865, there had been at least 15 million buffalo. A decade later, so 1875, fewer than 1,000 of the great beasts survived. And by destroying the buffalo herd, you basically undercut the Plains Indian economy, and you force them to try to you force them onto the reservations. Basically, it's they can't live off of it. How do you kill 15 million buffalo in a decade? You just keep killing buffalo. They have trains that bring amateurs out from the east, and you give them guns and you just let them shoot. Buffalo don't run when you shoot them. Okay, cows will run, horses will run when you fire guns. Buffalo don't have any experience with guns, and they stand there and get shot. Okay? You could probably find a clip or two from a movie or something like that of how this works. Now I'm going to make this a two-parter, and but I'm going to put up a clip from the movie Dances with Wolves. It's a very powerful scene. Kevin Costner ends up joining up with the I think it's a Sioux band, and it's not really an unusual story because a lot of people went Indian. White people went Indian over the centuries. Anyway, they go out hunting, and instead of finding live buffalo, they find dead buffalo with the skins off of them and the meat just rotting. You know, it's pretty hot on the plane, and it's a day or two after the slaughter has occurred. And it's just like, oh no, this is terrible. Because if the Indians had killed that buffalo, they would have preserved the meat in different ways so that they could eat it further down the line, dried it and stuff like that. But now it's like hundreds and hundreds of pounds of meat just wasted. All right, that should be enough for today. It takes me a long time to upload these, so I don't want to go too long with them. But the next videotape, which I may get up tomorrow, will be about Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. And then we'll move on to chapter 17, which is about workers and capitalism and unions. And for that one is the whole first part is about inventions, technological innovations that speed along capitalism. And then there's a section on rationalizing inequality, basically. Why do some people get to be enormously rich and other people have to struggle and live on the street and stuff like that? And then there's a section called The Ordeal of the Worker. The Ordeal of the Worker is the one I really want to concentrate on. The others you should skim through, okay? And the reason for that is workers get a bum rap in history books. They're either seen as like wild men who stage these violent strikes, or they're just ignored, just completely ignored. And I don't care how great your idea is. You know, the light bulb is a pretty great idea. It's the symbol of an idea, great idea. But if you're going to have workers to manufacture the bulbs, and you don't have workers to set up the electrical system to light the bulbs, you can't make any money off of them, okay? The airplane is a great idea. It's a great idea. But you have to have an airplane factory to manufacture enough airplanes. Right? And the classic example is Henry Ford and his cars, his Model T and his Model A. The assembly line is a great idea, although it makes work more intense for the workers. But if you don't have like thousands of guys doing this work, you can't build cars. So you really shouldn't ignore the workers. And it'll be jumping ahead because these first 1, 2, 3, 4, I think like these first 5 chapters are all from the Civil War basically to 1890 or so, from different angles, okay? There's Reconstruction, the South, there's conquering the West, there's industrial supremacy, or whatever they call it, which is spread out in a number of different places, but it's the same time period. There's a chapter called Age of the City. That's the same time period, but how urbanization is taking place. And I guess it's only those 4. I don't remember what the next chapter is. Age of the City. Yeah, and then it starts to move a little further. In this book, it's From Crisis to Empire is chapter whatever. And it really is until we get to the Progressive Era that you start moving forward chronologically. Okay? So it is a little bit of jumping ahead, but I'd like to talk about the IWW, or the Industrial Workers of the World, which is kind of a radical union founded in 1905. So there's not much in it in this book, but it's really a very important part of labor history. Right? All right, so have a good night or morning or whenever you're watching this. I can't get used to the time warps. And I'll hit you up very soon. Okay? And I'm sorry, weird things are happening. It takes me a really long time to grade stuff. I did a video for the 117 class that took took like a half a day to upload to YouTube. I couldn't believe it. So, all right. Thanks for listening.